Alright, so I'm just responding to my opponent's claim, which is for the United States to follow the rest of the developing world by adopting universal health care. My opponent's secondary claims were that it will make healthcare more available to the people, specifically U.S. citizens, improving overall health in America, and it will benefit by aiding businesses and by increasing worker productivity. Providing healthcare to everyone does improve overall health in America, but it does entail some bad side effects that affect the U.S. drastically. First and biggest issue is that it will raise taxes for all U.S. citizens, forcing the healthy people to pay for other people's medical care who really kind of need it. In order for universal health care to realistically work, taxes would have to be raised for all U.S. citizens. The problem with this is that it targets each American individually. With circumstances from each individual U.S. citizen being different, most average or high-class Americans would not be willing to pay extra in order for people who cannot afford it to kind of receive these type of benefits. It's basically like paying for a stranger's meal because you kind of have to. At the end of the day, the healthcare industry is a business, and there are no free meals when it comes down to financials. With a system like this, it can easily be abused. With healthcare being so available to the people, U.S. citizens would use this in several ways. Overall, U.S. citizens would push their health limits further since they know that they have this benefit and make the problems they have worse. On top of this, since healthcare is so accessible, people would go to the doctors for little issues like a cold or cough, which would make lines a lot bigger and less available for the people who really need to kind of see one. Now, with almost everyone showing up to doctors, supplies will also be more limited. With this, rations would have to be put into place in order to save the correct medicine for the severely ill, and this would make medicine and procedures more scarce in general. Again, lines will grow significantly at the healthcare clinics, turning the healthcare industry into a very crowded and overpopulated industry for the patients. Responding to my advocate's second claim, universal healthcare does show ways to benefit the economy, but not by aiding healthcare businesses. Realistically, this will hurt their industry. With universal healthcare, the healthcare industry will turn into a federally funded industry. Not only the doctors will get paid less, but government would regulate on making sure that they don't get paid too much either. Basically taking all the money and competition away from each individual healthcare business, with the government taking the driver's seat in the healthcare industry. According to a former post, a universal healthcare activist group, this could lead the United States to plunge more into a socialist country where the government controls the distribution of goods and services in this industry, giving them more power and placing a big restriction on medicines we need and ultimately when we can receive it. With no money and competition in the healthcare industry, the quality of healthcare employees would decrease and the amount of employees would also plummet. If the job isn't paying as much, the incentive to work or become a doctor will decrease. Doctors will lose ambition to become better, and the attraction of the job will ultimately fall. Specialties in regards to what doctors do the best jobs in certain procedures or medicine would die down as well, resulting in less experts for specific procedures and all that. Overall, universal healthcare does show signs where it can improve the economy, but it also shows significant signs of government debt since it is controlling almost everything health related. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for governments to run a very large-scale system, so cuts in other areas of the government will have to be put into place in order to kind of compensate for the needs of the universal health care. In the result, this can lead to less school funding, decrease in government jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Universal health care overall has great intentions, more health, more life, but the side effects that come with this plan clearly show why it should not be implemented.
All right, well, the structural stuff is fine. The first point is basically you've got a bunch of disadvantage arguments that you're presenting to the policy claim that the advocate is making. So instead of it being an issue of fact, it turns into an issue of policy. And we'll give you a little bit of leeway because if they're making an issue of policy, then you should be able to respond to those policy issues. Your primary argument is the cost issue on the first point, and then incentives and the rationing of supplies, both a little bit at the end of the first point and is the main part of the second point. I think those are reasonable counterclaims to make, but there's not a lot of evidence that supports them. You give an explanation about why you think they're going to be true. You're attempting to reason without any grounds and without any information to support your conclusions. I think it's a little bit hard to assume that your conclusion is going to be valid. I was wondering where there was some data that illustrated these points that you're talking about. For example, the tax rates having to increase or the resources having to be allocated in a particular way because people would want to utilize them more. There are, just as the advocate, I'm sure, used parallel examples to suggest why universal health care would be beneficial. There are plenty of examples of where universal health care is available, where it shows the kinds of things that you're talking about, delays in access or having to ration resources and thus giving power to the government. And of course, the tax liability issue is another thing. At the bottom of the second point, you're suggesting that we would have to cut other resources, and there's no explanation about why that's the case, assuming that there's a limitation. Look, if we've raised the taxes to pay for it, why would we have to cut anything else? Your argument would be that we couldn't raise enough taxes to pay for it on its own, so we'd have to do a combination of taxes and cuts in other programs to be able to do this, and I didn't really see a lot of proof on that. The one piece of evidence that I saw on the second point talked about how you're centralizing control, and it turns it into like a socialist sort of situation where the government has control and distributes the resources. And there's an argument to be made here that that's problematic, that's something that's undesirable, but you need to develop that argument a little bit more. All right, thank you.